Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marc Lamont Hill, owner of Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books, and I want to welcome you to what we expect to be a very, very exciting, really wonderful book talk. And we always do book talks throughout the week with a range of authors who we think have work that is important, urgent, insightful, and of course, beautifully written. And today, honestly, we're lucky to have someone whose work is all of those things. We have the great Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. She's the author of a book. It's called America Goddam: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. First of all, Treva, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be virtually with the Uncle Bobbie's family.
I know, I really was hoping that we would be able to have these events in the spring in person. And at some point, y'all, Uncle Bobbie's is going to get back in person. There's another COVID surge as of this week in Philadelphia. So I'm very glad that we're virtual right now, but I'm also excited to meet folk in person for, I think, our Malcolm X Day event, which you've been a part of before, maybe our first live event if things can calm down a bit. But in the meantime, it is good to see you virtually. I feel underdressed now, man. Yeah.
You see, on a tour with the dress. It's a celebration. Me, diva feminist wouldn't be me.
That's true. That is true. That is true. And I had the opportunity to read this book a few times. You were generous enough to allow me to read a draft of this, and then you let me read it again. I read it again at the end, and I read it again in preparation for talking to you. And in each case, I've been excited about this book. Talk to me about why you decided to write it. Why this book? Why now?
Yeah, I was actually kind of avoiding this book for a little while. I started the research years ago, but I really thought my next project was going to be a 90s project. I was going to talk about the history of Black girls, Black women in the 90s, looking at pop culture, looking at politics, looking at these different slices of life, and taking what I call this kind of Black zennial, this mix between bridge micro generation between Gen X and millennials, and thinking through a lot of this. But something happened, a pivot happened, both in my work, both in the world as well. And that was the lockdown of 2020 that happened, and kind of being in the house, being forced to kind of reckon with what eventually would become such gross disparities across different communities in terms of the impact of COVID on both literally lives being impacted, as well as livelihoods. And I knew very early on, the first piece that I wrote during the first kind of big wave of COVID was about the disproportionate effect of COVID on Black women. And secondarily, by May of that year, as we all know, the murder of George Floyd and subsequently the bringing to light the murder of Breonna Taylor really set a kind of course of events historically and importantly that just made me be like, you know what, this might be the time for this book. It might be the time to ask the question why we might not have known about Breonna Taylor's killing were it not for the killing of George Floyd. And kind of groundswell and collective organizing and outrage that emerged in response to that. I was also thinking about the ways that people who are at the home now in these intimate spaces, how we might see an increase in intimate partner violence and familial violence and other violence within domestic context. And I was also thinking about the violence of the medical care system in response to such a new and novel epidemic. And lastly, thinking about the ways that poor Black people in particular were going to be disparately affected by COVID. And so that led me to be like, I think this book needs to be written. I think there's an urgency behind this book. I think I'm committed to writing through this and thinking through this and finding a way to tell that story that could resonate with multiple audiences, but also just hit home and be accountable to the Black girls and women that I've always cared so deeply about in my research.
One of the places that you start is with this idea of goddamn. America Goddam obviously summons Nina Simone, it summons Mississippi Goddam. But it feels like you're using this not just as a clever title, but as a kind of analytic to help think through some of this stuff. Talk to me about why you chose this title.
Yes. So I tend to think in music. I tend to think in other expressive forms. And it's something about Mississippi Goddam and in terms of what it does and how it resonates, I should say. First, it's a song that is detailing these various acts of harm that Black people have endured. It's 3.5 minutes, and she's going through, and it kind of sounds like a show tune almost. It's just telling the story about anti-Black violence. And at the same time, she's also talking about the resistance to this violence in this song as well. The protests, the marches. We look at some of the key moments in which she performed the song, one of them being at the end of the Selma to Montgomery marches. So there's in this song both the goddamn that comes from just the relentlessness of anti-Black violence, as well as the resistance to it that she's chronicling. And I wanted this book to capture both the relentlessness as well as the resistance. And so this song became a way to think through what it meant to chronicle and document both what is happening to Black people and how Black people, in particular Black girls, women, and gender expansive people are responding to that. And secondarily, the song was inspired by both the assassination of Medgar Evers and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, which killed 4 Black girls, Addie, Denise, Carol, and Cynthia, and severely injured another little girl, Sarah. And so this is Nina Simone's first protest song. Right? This is the first song where she's like, I felt I needed to say something through my music about what was happening. And it is very fascinating to me that these sets of terrorizing incidences are what inspires her to write this music. And so looking at what are the radical moments, these transformative moments that push us to use our art forms, to use our expressive voice, to talk about what's happening. And so in that way, I'm following in the footsteps of Nina Simone, of using one of the expressive tools I have at my disposal to document, to chronicle, to challenge, to envision, and to imagine.
What's an unlivable life?
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this term as I was trying to think about how we talk about the intersection of capitalism, anti-Blackness, misogynoir, and other forms of oppression and marginalization that lead to Black women often experiencing what that there are all of these things bending towards premature death. And that's one of the most, I think, capacious readings of how we understand racism, is thinking about this kind of predisposal to premature death, right? One of the outcomes, and thinking about the work of someone like a Ruth Wilson Gilmore. But I was thinking about the compounding impact of these systems in the lives of poor Black women, of poor Black girls. And I had to really take a step back because the category of poor wasn't enough. I had to name the systems and the structures that were producing a context in which people are unhoused, people are food insecure, people are struggling to not be criminalized just for existing in the world. And for me, that meant having to come up with and think about a framework that explained that showed living and was still life affirming of people pushing through, pushing beyond, and still creating and imagining and loving and being in community, but also being asked to live the unlivable, to live what we don't ask others to live, and to live at the intersection of these death-dealing forces. And far too often at that intersection, what we find are Black girls and women who are maligned, who are criminalized, who are devalued, who are invisible or hyper-visible, and aren't seen as full persons worthy of our care.
This idea of being at once visible and invisible is really interesting to me, because it's a thread that cuts through much of your book, actually. Can you talk a little bit about how Black women, girls, and femmes show up in the world in this hyper visible and simultaneously invisible way, and how that impacts sort of how they negotiate these various spaces that you talk about in the book, from healthcare to housing to criminal legal system, etc.
Right. So first, I want to note, even in that framing, I want to take a step back for a second and say, invisible to whom? Right? So that matters deeply in that terms of framing. So even a statement like, no one cares about Black girls and women, which is something I think at some point I've definitely said, I'm invisibilizing the Black girls, women, gender expansive, agender people who do care about Black women and girls and who keep showing up. In fact, I'm honoring that tradition in the book, right? So to say that no one cares then renders those Black girls as no one. And that's never what I want to do. And so I believe we are visible and legible and felt and seen and embraced by one another in the work that we do. But thinking about that more broadly and saying, why don't more people care about or see us, is this movement between visibility and invisibility. So we become visible as problems. We become visible as those who need to be contained, who need to be maligned, who need to be seen as something to be fixed. So on one hand, we become visible in our classrooms as Black girls who have to be disciplined or thrown across a classroom by a school resource officer. And in that moment, only another Black girl is witnessing and calling it out and saying this is wrong. Or seeing a 6-year-old Black girl who's arrested and put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car, right? The behavior and that kind of criminalizing logic makes Black girls visible and Black women visible as problems, right? And so that is a kind of politics of visibility that always works against Black women, that's rooted in racist and sexist and demonizing stereotypes. And at the same time, we're invisible when we go missing, right? There are over 90,000 Black girls and women missing in the United States right now. When I first started the research for this book, it was around 64,000.
Wow.
When I started researching this book and writing about this book, about an average of a Black woman was killed about an average of every 19 hours a day. Right before I went into production, it was every 17 hours. And the most recent data point around that is an average of 4 Black women and girls a day are killed. And so the fact that we're not sounding an alarm around that, and I'm not talking about a carceral alarm or alarm or that, but to look at the structures and systems that are allowing for that kind of murderous activity to continue without that kind of recognition, and getting at the core of what's happening in these moments that we see such egregious numbers of harm befalling Black girls and women in so many ways, is how I was beginning to think about what it meant to put alongside this invisibility and visibility that's happening with Black girls and women in our larger public discourse.
One of the things I love about this book is that it is an abolitionist text. It operates in the abolitionist tradition. Both the analysis and the sort of explicit and more often sort of implied solutions to some of these problems are in that tradition, but it's not an overtly abolitionist book in the way that Derricka Purnell's book is, or in the way that Mariame Kaba's book is, or that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis's work is. But you're clearly in conversation with them, and you're clearly politically on the same page as them. Can you talk a little bit about how abolition or an abolitionist vision sort of informs this text?
Right. So one part of this is because this is a blend as a historian, as someone trying to conceptualize and think through this violence, and it's also memoir. It's also talking about my own experiences with violence. That part of doing that for me, especially as the historian, was saying there are multiple Black feminist traditions, right? There are Black feminist traditions that are not abolitionists. There are Black feminist traditions that are abolitionists or, moving along the spectrum, abolitionists in training, right? There are a multitude of Black feminist standpoints and perspectives on how we think about carcerality and abolition more broadly, not only prison and police abolition, but gender abolition and sexuality abolition, various forms of abolishing practices. And so for me, it was important to think through the multitude of Black feminist approaches to these questions and to be in conversation with folks like, as you mentioned, Mariame Kaba and Sarah Haley and Andrea Ritchie and Emily Thune. It's important for me to do that, as well as being in conversation with folks who wouldn't necessarily identify with an abolitionist tradition with regards to this. For my own entry point into this, as someone who's experienced violence and knows the stakes of this, growing into abolition was really important for me in terms of how I move through that and how I respond to violence at a structural level, at a systemic level, And so because that insertion is there, I think the politic really comes through in terms of how I'm writing the book, how I'm caring, even in this book, for those who've done harm, especially when I'm thinking about intracommunal violence, that the impulse here isn't around, we need to lock this person up, or we need to detain this person, or that there's always this punitive response, but rather looking at the conditions that led us to this moment, so that we're not just responding to the spectacular moment at which something happens, but all of the moments prior to that, that we could have made life-affirming choices, right? Life-affirming choices at a systemic, structural, and communal level. And so for me, that really came through. The abolitionist sentiment and perspective of the book really comes through in the memoir portion of this, and who I'm citing and thinking through, right? My conclusion of the book is largely about the discipline of hope, which I'm learning from abolitionists like Kava. And so that was important to me to say, here is this long tradition. Here are these people I'm in conversation with. I'm citing them not just because you should cite people when you're crediting their work, but because this
is— you should.
Which you should. That's not the only reason, but that this is a collective enterprise of moving towards freedom, right? And resisting the conditions of unfreedom. And to me, to invest in a carceral logic in response to violence, it's still just investing in another form of unfreedom, which is not a context that I think is our best way forward out of the goddamn, right? Out of the weight of violence that Black women and girls experience.
Intracommunal violence. You've mentioned it a couple of times in this conversation, but it comes up in the book in multiple places, but the chapter is devoted to it. And I'm thinking about that chapter in light of the particular moment we're in right now, the post-Oscars moment. I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on Will Smith or Chris Rock, although I'm sure you got lots of. But it is interesting to hear the dialogue right now in terms of how we are engaging conversations about Black masculinity, about Black manhood, about violence, about what it means to protect and affirm women, and in what contexts and spaces we're supposed to be doing that. And so what I've realized just in these conversations, these public conversations, is that we're sort of all over the place, and there's a lot of messiness and a lot of contradiction and a lot of trauma underneath, as Esther Armand would say, untreated trauma underneath that stuff, and then overdetermines some of this stuff. And so I guess what I want you to help me think through is intracommunal violence. Not just, it's a fact that there's a lot of harm being done to Black women and girls, and it's a fact that Black men are purveyors of that harm in many forms and fashions. Whether it's Black cis women, whether it's Black trans women, there's just lots of harm being done. But your book goes a layer deeper and still embraces, I think, an ethic of care and hope, while still calling for accountability and justice. How do you help me think through a little bit of how you're talking about this stuff?
Yeah, so that chapter was the hardest to write by far, because it felt so deeply personal, because I feel accountable to Black people across genders. And I, in the beginning of the book, really am like, this is not Oppression Olympics. This is not about displacing cishet Black men and boys, but really about a specificity and a precision. I even say that with regards to focusing explicitly on what we know as the United States. And I could talk about, Black women and violence across the world. There's so many stories to be written and to be told with regards to that. So mine is about specificity. And so I talk about being concerned at the way that writing this chapter could be weaponized against Black people because of the impulse, the carceral impulse that we have that is so widespread in response to violence, despite the fact that the same systems that people are investing in are also violent and doing violence in these communities. And so the home space, both in the context of police violence and intercommunal violence, is so fraught for Black women and girls. So what spaces where we tend to think of ourselves as safe, and I very rarely use safe in the book because even that still feels like it's locked into some kind of carceral logic of safety when you're not talking about structural reassurance and being shored up within systems that allow for you not to be harmed. But we know that patriarchy intersects with white supremacy and anti-Blackness and manifests in transphobic attacks and manifest in queerphobic attacks, that manifest in interpersonal relationships and interpersonal dynamics among people. And it means holding multiple truths at the same time. So it means holding that when I see and I witness an assault of a Black woman by a young Black man, and the police arrive on the scene because someone called them. And to this day, we're all like, who called them? We didn't want the police to come, right? But they're here. So now I'm worried about both the care that the young woman is going to receive by the paramedics because of what I know about the medical industrial complex and how Black women are treated, but also wanting her to be cared for. And now police are here, and we're in this moment where we know that this could go left very quickly. And so now I'm witnessing to ensure that this young man isn't harmed. In that moment, who just harmed the young woman who we were intervening for. And so there's multiple sites of intervention that are happening here because the care practice that I'm asking us or hoping that we're willing to embrace is seeing the full personhood in its complexities and its flaws, in its internalization of very harmful narratives. Is
and the fact that you have to make that decision, or that your emotional energy is divided in that way, or that you have to even account for what the help is going to do to the person who needs to be helped. Is that the goddamn? Is that part of the goddamn too?
It's part of the goddamn, because it is absolutely moving you in multiple directions simultaneously. And at some point, right, you're just expended, right? I talk about the end, specializing in the wholly impossible, the tagline of Nannie Helen Burroughs' school in Washington, D.C., that it's impossible, right? And so we can't do that. And the things that we do specialize in mean that they're possible, which I think is a really good reframing of imagination, that what we're specializing in is just that you haven't seen it done. It does not mean it's not possible. And Black women and Black girls and gender expansive people are consistently finding ways to render otherwise possible, as Sean Crowley would say. And so I wanted to think about in that moment, and I think immediately in that moment, I wanted everybody to go home, right? In that moment, I wanted everybody to make it home to their loved ones. But I was so angry at this young man for causing harm to this young woman. And in that moment, everybody, every Black person at the scene of that particular assault was now vulnerable to police violence, which in many ways feels redundant to say because policing is violent, but was now in a position where we're all concerned about everyone's life on the scene, including his. And so nothing in me would allow me to turn away from that, even with the anger that I held for the kind of patriarchal violence he had just enacted on this young woman.
I remember you telling me that story before you wrote it in the book. And I remember you recounting to me the details of it. And I remember how pained you were by it. I wasn't surprised to see it in the book, but I was sort of jarred by the idea that you had to write through pain in that way. You had to write through pain to talk about your experience as a teenage girl with this police officer. You had to write through pain to talk about other experiences that you've had. You made a decision to make this book part memoir, or at least part reflection. Talk to me about what it took for you to arrive at that decision. Because you're a historian, y'all don't be doing that, right? And yeah, I mean, I'm just curious, you know, and then what was it? And then once you made that decision, what was it like actually executing that decision? Because one thing to say, I'm going to do this, but then to actually risk the self on the page is something else.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was terrified, and there are a number of things that didn't make it in the book that I just wasn't ready yet to talk about in that way or write through in that way. And so much of this book, as you know, was written in lockdown, right? Like we weren't going anywhere. I'm not going out. I'm not seeing my friends. I'm not a big hugger, but Lord, did I want to hug in the middle of all of this, right? So it was really fascinating to make a choice to write a book that was going to pour some of me onto the page. But I took my own cue from what I was writing. And I said that the call for this is coming from Ntozake Shange, right? To handle Black girls warmly. That includes myself in doing this. And I thought that the best way to tell these stories of Black girls experiencing this violence was both witnessing it and witnessing it. And so writing from among survivors, writing from among those who've experienced the loss of someone due to domestic violence, writing from among those who were in community with folks who were criminalized for drug addiction. Like, this meant a lot to me, and I didn't want to take that out. I feel like that evacuated some of the stakes of this work. And there was a way that I think, as a scholar, I wanted someone who's reading this to feel like they're in the room with me. And if you're in a room with me, I am a historian. I'm also a feminist scholar, and I also am a dancer, and I'm also a godmother and a friend. And I wanted all of those notes to be possible in the way that someone is processing this very heavy material, because I recognize just how heavy this book is. And you really have to care for yourself throughout this process. And so I invite people to do that, but also to have these moments with me riding in the car with my dad, or, you know, putting before that assault moment happened, and I talked about being in the car with my mom and giving her a hug. Like, I wanted to walk you through these moments before I drag you into the depths of thinking about this violence, and give you certain details about the people who I'm talking about, so they're not just objects of study, which meant doing that for myself as well. And I think ultimately there was something very healing about
Really?
these, and being ready to talk about them, being, you know, preparing myself to have questions about some of what I bring up in the book, not only about other people, but experiences that I've encountered. And to forthrightly say, these stakes are high for me too. And that is why it was so important for me to bring those together. They're not separate. This history is not separate from my lived experience, from the material realities that are impacting Black girls like me. And I think that intimacy lends itself very well to reading this through both an effective lens of like, damn, this is happening to Black girls and women, and affectively like, damn, that's happening to the person who wrote this book. That's happening to someone who's in a community that I know, which is why there are examples from all over the nation, so as to not make this seem singularly placed, that there's some level of intimacy that I hope that this would create. And by bearing my own stories in that, I felt like I could have a different kind of intimate moment with any reader of this book, that they could feel and see themselves and feel a little bit of me moving through the world. And that's exciting in a moment where for 2 years, I haven't really been able to connect with people in the way that I usually would have.
Who'd you write this for?
Black girls. I wrote it for Black girls. I'm happy that other people will read it and hopefully, you know, think about these questions, look at the amazing organizations that I list at the end of the book as a way of organizations to support and provide resources to find out what they're doing, amplifying their work. But I want these Black girls to know that I see you, that their names are somewhere, that they're somewhere beyond just this spectacular moment, but really put into a broader context of Black women and girls who've been snuffed out by the state or diminished by various forms of violence and harm, and that there's something beyond that moment that made part of your life. I really attempted to offer something about their lives that wasn't just this spectacular moment where this violence occurred or this harm occurred. I wanted you to know if she was a brownie, if she sang, if she made TikTok videos, if, you know, she loved to post on Twitter, like whatever it was, I wanted there to be something there that this person was here and not just this posthumous symbol of the ways that too often Black folks are predisposed towards premature death, right? Or slow death or unlivable living.
Everybody, we are talking to Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. She's the author of this wonderful book. It's called America Goddam: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. I want to make sure that we create time and space for other people to ask questions. So if you have a question, either preferably hit the ask a question button, but I know sometimes people don't do that. If you leave it as a comment, that also is incredibly important. I want to do that. Let's go to one of the questions that's already up. And the question is from Kay Yvonne, and it's, thank you for caring and writing this book now. How do you think we can foster or encourage a discipline of hope for the young ones?
Well, I'm always inspired by the young ones, I must say. I just was on a panel earlier for Abolition is Feminism, Feminism is Abolition, organized by Andrea Ritchie. And I was on a panel with all these organizers. I was there to kind of give the historical context as a scholar with another amazing Black feminist historian, Sarah Haley. And hearing the kind of work that they're doing, like they're committed to, talking to young people about abolition is such a fascinating thing because so many of them aren't so wedded to the imagination, the carceral imagination that so many of us have internalized, that they're going to be learning abolition. And for me, it was unlearning carceral logics and beginning to learn abolition. And I always tell my students, the educator, that unlearning is so much more difficult than learning, right? Because you're getting new information, which is exciting and dynamic and wonderful. But when you're unlearning, it's not that you're just questioning something you learned before. Now you're questioning who told it to you, the systems you have, the relationship that's now put into question with wherever you learn that. So if you learn that in your religious community, if you learn that in your family, if you learn that in your peer group, what kind of distance does that create between you and them? And so to understand learning as a relational process means that when we get to talk to youth and we remain disciplined, I'm inspired by what they offer in terms of their ability to learn, think, and imagine in really generative ways that aren't rooted in the carceral reality so many of us were thinking about. They're also thinking about questions of gender and sexuality and ableism as default. They're not just adding them at the end and stirring. The hope for me lies in the fact that they are approaching this thinking about multiplicative oppression. They're thinking through intersectional lenses. They're thinking through multiple jeopardy. They're thinking globally. They're learning from one another. And so I think the intergenerational exchanges that are being made possible through different modes of organizing gives me hope. And the discipline about that to me is being steadfast. Right? This is not necessarily saying we just got to be as unrelenting as these systems are, but being steadfast in our commitments, our tenacity for learning, for speaking with one another, for caring with one another, for caring for one another, and showing up in those ways. And that discipline is one that is rooted in care, which is rooted in love, which is rooted in accountability, that we are accountable to one another. And that though often we practice calling out more so, that part of what I'm calling us to do is to call each other in and recognize how these systems are creating and facilitating such incredibly death-dealing dynamics between us, and saying, let's move to things that are soul and life-affirming between us. That gives me hope that we can do that and have these relational dynamics as opposed to these adversarial dynamics when thinking about how we get free. And that opens up space for a multitude of perspectives. We don't all have to have the same perspective to believe that the conditions of unfreedom are unjust.
What does freedom look like?
It is, every day that kind of changes for me, because I also think as a Black feminist, part of my work is to practice freedom, even amidst the conditions of unfreedom. I think it means loving really intently and justly on people. And to love people means to ensure that people have what they need and what they want. I know that often we stick to the need thing, right? A basic income, some kind of housing, I want people's wildest imaginations to be part of this. I think one of the reasons we saw, kind of thinking about the Amazon labor union, an incredible victory, that was one of the demands, right, was the $30 an hour, which in many ways far exceeds some of the other demands of more mainstream labor movements. And I was like, that's freedom to me, to even imagine beyond, right, what is saying this data point is that suggests that you are only deserving of this if you have this degree, or deserving of that. We're deserving of abundance. And I think that freedom for me is an abundance of ways of feeling like you are cared for, and that the ways that you articulate care mean that we're relationally engaging in ways that are not harmful, in ways that are creating more opportunities for love and are opening up space for people, right? That there's something that is very capacious about the space of freedom. And I also realize my imagination is still limited in terms of what freedom looks like. And that is still part of my own unlearning.
Yeah.
As I'm moving through that, right? And so I remain committed to hearing and learning about how other people think about freedom and imagine freedom so that I become more liberatory in my inclinations within my imagined spaces, right? Within these imaginary spaces and within my struggles to attain those spaces.
When I first read this book, you hadn't written your epilogue yet. You hadn't written this letter to Micaiah Bryant, right? Am I pronouncing that right? It's Micaiah. Two questions. One, what compelled you to add this letter? The epilogue is a letter to her. What compelled you to write this? And second, what did this form, this epistolary form, allow for that couldn't be executed through the other forms that are used throughout the book?
Come on, word. All right. So, the book was done. The book was done. It was in production. And I'm sitting in the hair salon in Columbus, Ohio, and all masked up and all other things, my hairstylist. And at that moment, the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial had come out, was released. So I'm seeing it on Twitter that he's convicted, multiple counts in the murder of George Floyd. And it is literally within minutes. So it's like finishing up my hair, getting in the car. I'm seeing tweets about and a news alert about someone being shot by police in Columbus. Then it's a teenager. Then it's a Black teenager. And then it's a Black girl. And I quickly get a lot of information and talking with folks, with other organizers in the city and other people who've been involved in responses to police violence in Columbus, which Columbus has the second highest rate of killing minors in the country. And so at the time, it was just jarring. And I just immediately wanted to amplify who she was because I knew almost immediately that there was going to be this villainization, and particularly because it was quickly released that she had a knife. And so there was this immediate impulse to be like, well, this is unreasonable. That's a justifiable killing. And I'm sitting here as the daughter of two educators, like my peeps have de-escalated things with far more fatal instruments, right? I'm thinking of teachers and social workers and other people who intervene in these situations. And so I knew that there was going to be this maligning of her, this criminalizing of her. And as more and more details came out about her, I reached out to my editor and I was like, I have to write about this. I don't want to put it in the chapter per se. I've already written about police violence. I've already talked about these things. I just want to recommit to her. I just want to address certain things in it. There are no citations in that letter. It's not about a framing. It is really this emotional commitment to Micaiah, to her sister Janiyah, to her family, to other Black girls, that I remain so fiercely committed to creating worlds in which she's still here, because there's no justice for her. Like, even if the officer who killed her had been charged, which of course he was not, that's not justice. It doesn't bring her back to her family. That doesn't respond to the multiple calls she and her sister had made trying to be removed from the foster care home that they were in. I think it's no coincidence that my book came out the same day as the amazing Dorothy Roberts' Torn Apart book of looking at the child welfare system and thinking about Micaiah Bryant through these two different lenses of what puts her in this position where she's spectacularly killed by police. And so I just needed to love on her and to make sure that I could tell her story in a way that countered so many of the criminalizing, maligning, and just demonizing narratives that existed about her and still do around her.
How do you write a book like this and stay sane and happy and healthy and balanced?
I hope that that's what I am. In this moment, I think I wrote it and I stepped away and I said, whatever I write next is going nothing to do with violence or harm. And that's a little bit impossible to do, but it was a commitment of mine. Like, this was a book that I had to write. Like, it felt, there was something that was being demanded of me. And I'm looking and pulling from all these different places. I'm sitting with this archive that I'm amassing. I'm writing these pieces about violence and across time, whether that's the serial sexual predation against Black girls or maternal morbidity or what reproductive justice struggles look like distinctively for Black people with gestational capacity. Like, all of these things were converging and I just had to get it out and write. And then hope that people would be attending these conversations and wanting to do more and looking at the end of the book and seeing how they could get involved and seeing who is doing this work and seeing that folks do care about Black girls. And that goes back to that question you had about who am I writing this for? I want Black girls to know there are people fighting for them and that there are ways that they can link into those communities who are already loving on them and seeking to love them in a world that often feels so hell-bent on being unloving and uncaring towards us. And so this, to me, gave me an opportunity to open up to love and open up to the possibilities of building even deeper community with Black women and girls and gender-expansive people by having this as an entry point.
You made a decision to, it seems, to write this to a bigger audience. You know, I've read most of your work. I read your last book. I've read articles. You've given me that work. And all of it was good. And you always seem to be intentional about writing in ways that isn't unnecessarily dense, unnecessarily inaccessible. But this book feels like it's in an even wider kind of community of readers. And so when I read this book, I was like, "Oh, this is one of them." This book is for everybody. I mean, I understand the intention of writing for Black girls, but in terms of its accessibility and its range, it seems like you're trying to write outside of the university.
Yes.
Why? And what does it mean to be able to take to be able to take complicated ideas like these and try to bring them to a broader audience?
Yeah. I mean, most Black girls aren't in the academy, right? And even though the academy is its own space of harm and violence for Black women, girls, and gender expansive people, I certainly wanted to think about who I'm accountable to. I mean, it's an amazing point to reach where you get to think about citation and writing and voice and form and all of that through the lens simply of who am I accountable to? Who do I want this to resonate with? I'm, again, happy that other people resonate with it. I'm happy that my colleagues see this as a rigorous and dynamic and well-written text proving blah, 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 and they can see the archival work in it. But I'm more attentive to someone picking this up and feeling seen and held and cared for in the ways that I'm approaching it. And to me, that meant creating and crafting a voice in this book that's both different from my more traditional academic writing and even some of my more publicly engaged, where you have, 800 to 1,200 words to do something, right? Here I had 80,000 or so words to just write and think and figure out how I wanted this to read and how I wanted to build breath into it, what the rhythm of this text would be. And so for me, there are parts of this where I just sit and talk for a little bit and then have it transcribed and kind of move it around, because I also wanted to feel like you're having a conversation with someone as you're reading it, which allows for, and if you have a conversation with me, it's never that I'd ever fully take the scholar hat off. I'm still going to probably bring in some data, some archive or something.
Oh, for sure.
But then there's going to be this moment. Okay, girl, right? There's these levels. And I wanted a book that captured a multitude of levels in which we engage in these conversations. So you're going to get, heteropatriarchy, you're going to get, and some terms around gestational capacity and some other terms that we would feel more academic, but you're also, it's a book called Goddam, in the title. And so there is a level of just, we're conversing. We are just shoot the shit. We just talking. And I wanted that to come through. And so this really was a challenge for me to think about how I wanted to write this and how I wanted it to be read and take it up and provide an opening for a number of people to take this up in the ways they're necessary, for whether that be an organizer, a Black girl reading it in high school, another scholar reading it, a journalist reading it. I wanted all of them to be able to take away a little bit of something and hopefully be inspired to move in particular ways, to care more deeply about what's happening to Black girls and women.
Well, you absolutely accomplished that. The goal that you set out to do, I think you've done with aplomb. You've written a book that is deeply unsettling in the best sense of that word. You're forcing us to unlearn. You're forcing us to dislodge ourselves from taking for granted assumptions about the world. You're also taking people who are critical and thoughtful about particular sectors of our social world and redirecting us to other areas where we may not have considered. Some of us are very much read into the carceral realities of America, but haven't thought that much about what the hospital looks like. And some people haven't thought about what it means to actually navigate the physical streets of this world as a Black woman or girl or femme, and what that means to the psyche, what that means to the body, what that means to the spirit. There's a way that you're forcing us to look at the world through new eyes. The writing of this book is magical. I'm so incredibly excited and energized by this book, because this book stands as a testimony to what's possible when you commit to writing for the people, to the people, and in some ways with the people. It's incredibly exciting to read. It's incredibly heartwarming to read. Again, it's a very challenging book. It's definitely not a motivational speech in here, but you don't leave us. You don't leave us there. In the church, in my backsliding days, before my backsliding days, they would say, God love you just the way you are, but love you too much to leave you that way. And that's how this book feels in so many ways to me. This book is dripping with love for Black folk, as we are. But you also dare to leave us, Black folk, and the broader community, the broader world. You dare us to imagine new futures, new worlds, new selves, new possibilities that are more fair, more just, more humane, and more loving, but especially to Black women and girls. I think that this book should win all the awards. I think that it should be read by all the eyes. And I think that it's going to make not just an immediate impact, but have an enduring intervention in our conversations, in our idea making, and hopefully in our actions throughout the world. So Dr. Treva B. Lindsey, thank you. Thank you for this book. Thank you for loving us so relentlessly. And thank you for hanging out with Uncle Bobbie's today.
Thank you so much for having me. Definitely got to come through at some point.
Yes.
Get up folks, I'm a Philly folks in here. Thank you to everyone who came and engaged. And yeah, if you can get a book for a friend.
Yes.
Someone. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for this conversation and for the very deep reading of the text. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you.
Always. Everybody, she ain't lying though. Buy a couple of these. See, the way that Black folk stay, able to write these kinds of books is when they know that there's a market for it. And shout out to Naomi Schneider and the folks at University of California Press for seeing the vision of this wonderful, brilliant book and allowing it to happen and doing everything possible to make it accessible to the widest audience possible. So now it's up to us to support the book. Obviously, I'd love if you click that green button down there that says buy for Uncle Bobbie's. But honestly, I just want this book purchased. If you buy it from another independent bookstore, if you buy, I don't care. Just don't go to Amazon. But any place else, buy this book and buy it for someone who you think needs it. Buy it for someone you think could deserve, deserves the kind of insight and hope that this book offers. Buy it for friends and family. Buy it for the Black girl or boy, for that matter, who needs this type of analysis. Even if you ain't met them yet, buy it and hold it for them. You know, let's support this book. Let's support Treva. Everybody, and support Uncle Bobbie's. We got a bunch of stuff coming up. We got a bunch of author events. We mentioned Dorothy Roberts. I'll be in conversation with her, I believe, April 26th at the Philadelphia Free Library, but we will probably stream it live. Also, check out Coffee and Books podcast. It is coming back. I will be hosting the podcast again. And Dr. Treva B. Lindsey has agreed to do another conversation with me about this book. And this time I'm going to ask her some real tough questions, not just about the book, but about her writing process, about her journey as a writer and as a reader, growing up in DC. I'm going to ask her all the stuff that we don't ask in these types of talks. So go to Coffee and Books podcast. Make sure you check that out. Support Uncle Bobbie's and just keep the faith, y'all. We'll see y'all later. Peace.
Take care.